Melissa, this is Aubrey, and this is Quincy, and this is the third out of four videos that we're making discussing film and costume design with an emphasis on gender. And specifically, we're talking about variations of films throughout decades and how the costumes change with the times. One of the best examples of this, I think, in a single film is in Singin' in the Rain, which has costumes by Walter Plunkett, who is a very well-known costume designer. He also did Gone with the Wind. Singin' in the Rain came out in 1952. It takes place in 1927, and it follows the film industry as sound was introduced. But in the film, they're filming another movie, which appears to be set in like the Rococo era, and so we get a 1950s look at a 1920s version of Rococo fashion. So it's just, you know, a bunch of different trends and like styles sort of combining, and the costumes and silhouettes of Singing in the Rain are particularly interesting because the 20s and 50s are so drastically different that it creates a very interesting look.
It's like Downton Abbey.
Mm-hmm. It is like the one Downton Abbey movie that is the exact plot of Singing in the Rain, yes. Yeah.
When one man alone dared challenge the might of his country's oppressor, one leader and his stalwart band, Robin Hood, outlaw of Sherwood Forest.
The first set of films or stories that we're going to be talking about is Robin Hood. Douglas Fairbanks' and Robin Hood is from 1922, and it was the first big action movie. It had like a movie premiere, and it had all these big movie stars. The costumes were designed by Mitchell Leeson, and the fashion in it is understandably very 1920s. The costumes of the women, they have very straight silhouettes and like drop waists. Marion has these like dark long like ringlets, and she has like flapper silent film makeup. This Robin Hood in particular, though, Douglas Fairbanks Robin Hood, he's different from other Robin Hoods because he's sort of before the common idea of Robin Hood that we now have and like associate with him. The first time he interacts with Marion, he's afraid to talk to her. He's not this like charismatic masculine hero that we like typically associate with Robin Hood. He has the Robin Hood tights that everyone knows and also makes fun of Robin Hood for because they think it's, you know, like girly. It's become like a stereotype. It's seen in like the 1993 Men in Tights. It's the name of the movie. They're just sort of like made fun of. Like their sexuality even is made fun of because they're wearing tights. The next big Robin Hood movie was in 1938, and it was directed by William Keighley and Michael Curtiz, who also directed Casablanca, White Christmas, and like a bunch of very well-known like old Hollywood movies. And this was the first Warner Brothers movie that they had Technicolor in. The costumes were by Milo Anderson, who was working on a lot of films in the 1930s. He'd already designed for Olivia de Havilland and Errol Flynn in Captain Blood. They're the main stars. They're Robin and Marion. And the costumes in this movie, they're not historically accurate in any sense. They just give this sort of impression of like they're medieval, but you know, they're not like actually what people would have worn in the 1100s. It looks like a storybook. It literally looks like the medieval like illuminations, the drawings, just like the bright colors and everything. And it's also very 1930s with its fashions, just like the previous one was very 1920s. Maid Marian obviously has the most costumes. She's very fashionable. And Basil Rathbone, who plays Sir Guy of Gisborne, has the second he has the second most costume changes, I believe, at 7 costumes. They designed them so that people watching in 1938 would enjoy them. So they have these fashion trends of 1938. There's like Art Deco inspirations in a lot of what Marion wears. Mm-hmm. And these like shiny like silky fabrics and these like floral patterns and everything. It's very 1930s. It's a very 1930s idea of the 1100s. Yeah. And you can see she has like these like jewels and like this velvet and everything, and the way it like falls is like cut sort of like the bias cut like 1930s dresses and everything. They, as costumes should, aid with the storytelling. And so as Marion and Robin like fall more in love, the costumes sort of begin to match Robin's almost in a way. They become like lighter as she becomes an image of like innocence and goodness and morality because she starts to like defy Prince John, and her costumes just reflect her like changing attitudes towards Robin and, you know, the Saxons and the Normans. She has her hair covered for most of the movie, which I found really interesting. But a lot of movies, in order to like appease the modern audience, they don't have the women cover their hair because for most of like since movies have been created, it's more appealing to have women with, you know, like their long pretty hair. But Marion has her hair covered the entire movie except one scene when Robin comes to her bedroom, and so obviously she is just wearing her hair in braids.
It's really interesting that you said, though, that to appease the modern audience, because I think when someone's being historically accurate, like to the T, they lose a modern audience because it's like boring or dull, and so
you want that like connection with the audience, and in order to have that, you have to like
spice it up.
You have to have something like recognizable, sort of. And so even Marion, when she does like wear her hair down, it has these like 1930s like waves in it almost. And, you know, she has makeup on the entire time, very 1930s makeup, obviously. Yeah, it's very interesting how what they choose to take away from history and what they choose to like reference as modern trends.
I feel like a lot of the time that recognizable aspect comes in with the hair because like that's something that modern audiences wouldn't even recognize. Clothes are very recognizable. I don't think hairstyles are most of the time.
I mean, I'm biased because this is actually my favorite movie, but I think that this is our idea of what Robin Hood is, because he's like incredibly charismatic, he's very like friendly and kind, but he still has like that arrogance, like that's his flaw. So he's, you know, like has all these very human traits to him, but he's still like a good man.
Why, you speak treason.
Fluently.
It is funny to compare him to Claude Rains, who plays Prince John in this, because Prince John, he's so much shorter and he has like these little like bangs, and he just like visually, when they're standing on screen next to each other, it looks to me like they're trying to make Prince John kind of more like feminine, honestly, because, you know, they're like, he's not Robin Hood. And I think that that's something that you see in a lot of following I think even in the 1922 one, I think that's a trait that sticks with Prince John, is that he has like more feminine traits. And so he just like appears like beneath Robin Hood. Like that's how it's communicated like visually to an audience. Like even in the animated Disney one, there's just something so like adventurous and fun about the like earlier versions, the ones that are so colorful, like with their Technicolor. In the following years, there's like a couple of attempts to sort of capitalize on the success of the 1938 Robin Hood. Some of them even have, I believe, the same costumes. There's a costume that Sir Guy of Gisborne wears, and I kept seeing it in these Robin Hood movies. They kept reusing the same costumes to like capture the same just love that the 1938 movie got. One of the more notable Robin Hood movies is Disney's The Story of Robin Hood and His Merry Men, which is from 1952. The costume designer is Michael Whitaker, who also did the one from 1954. So he did multiple Robin Hood costumes. And this is Disney's first Robin Hood movie. And it's not the one with the fox. It has real people. Maid Marian doesn't appear in like the earliest Robin Hood stories. She comes into existence around 1600, and one early story of Maid Marian mentions her dressing up as a page to go and like find Robin. The 1952 film does have her dressing up as a page to go and find Robin, which is interesting because it's the 1950s, and the 1950s are so like strongly set in our memory as like these traditional gender roles. So I think it's interesting that this is like one of the first Robin Hood films to have that happen. She is also very different from the earlier Maid Marians. The 1922 one and the 1938 one, they're like these very composed, like elegant ladies. The 1938 one, she has like an active role in the story. She has this really cool scene where she stands up against Prince John, and you know, Guy of Gisborne and all of these men who are more powerful than her. And she's like, no, I've seen you guys have been lying to me, and I've seen that these people are suffering, and I want to help. And in the 1952 one, the Disney one, she's kind of like childish, and she's like mischievous. Like she and Robin, we see them like playing together when they're younger. Like she's kind of like a little girl. When she dresses as a page, it has like a pretty childish silhouette to her even. Like it has this little, like, she looks like a triangle. She's so cute. She does still maintain like her 1950s beauty standard ideals, even if she's dressed as a boy. Like she has makeup on, and when she takes her hood off, her hair like falls out like perfectly done. And when she's not wearing like this little cape, she has like a belt and everything that's like cinched in. So she's not very convincing.
Like the 1938 version, I think its costumes also were very much still in that category of theatrical, like less of the historical accuracy. It was very much very lighthearted, and I feel like the way Marion was portrayed in this was not the typical way that I've seen or heard of in stories, because I feel like normally she is a damsel, and this time she's more of, they were best friends in their childhood, and then she just seemed more proactive.
Another film, though, where Marion dresses up like a page is the 1991 film Robin Hood. There were 2 Robin Hood films in 1991. One of them is much more well-known. That's the one with Kevin Costner. The one where Uma Thurman as Marion dresses up like a page is the other one from 1991. As Robin Hood movies go on, they get like a grimier, darker look to them. And this movie is not an exception to that. Both of the 1991 films have like a very dark, like dirty look to them. Marion in this film, she cuts her hair to escape an arranged marriage, and she like dresses up in boys' clothes and runs away to the forest. And the best part is Robin doesn't recognize her.
I like the colors and costumes too, the 1990s, and even the later one that's in the late 2010s. The color becomes more dull, and it's not as poppy. And like the clothing, there's a lot more drapes, I feel like. And one of the costume designers who actually designed for Pride and Prejudice and the Emma movies, she was saying that she's like, we honestly, as a modern society, always don't give the past credit enough, because she's like, if you really were to look at historical garments and the seams, they had color. Like, it wasn't dark and earth tones. Like, they did have color. And so it's really interesting that, like, that's what it reverts to.
Like, associates in my mind with the grunge movement of like the 90s. At the very end, it is very dark and like grimy the entire time, but at the very end they make a point at Robin and Marion's, like they have a little wedding at the very end, and it like gets bright. Like the last minute of the movie has these very bright colors. The other 1991 Robin Hood movie is much more beloved and well known, which is Prince of Thieves. And the costumes in this one are done by John and Anne Bloomfield. And like the other 1991, it has like a very dark and grimy look to it. A lot of people like this movie, and I think it's because it's very nostalgic to them. There was the Dungeons and Dragons like craze of like the 80s, and that sort of atmosphere and aesthetic of these like dark medieval movies, it sort of fits into this movie. Also, it's like supernatural. Like it has a witch in it. And I don't think any of the other Robin Hood movies have that. Alan Rickman is the Sheriff of Nottingham, who is the main antagonist of this movie. Sir Guy of Gisborne, he looks like he's in a 90s band. Like these sort of like 90s alternative style elements I see in this movie.
The satanic culture, I think, really took a rise during that time too.
There's the satanic panic of the 1980s.
Yeah.
I think we can see like elements of that very specific culture in this movie. Marion in this one, she very like elegant. She has these like long fancy dresses, and she also has very big curly hair, which is very 80s. She physically fights Robin when she first meets him, but she is ultimately a damsel, you know. He's very like childish and immature. When he first meets Marion, she's like, I can't trust you because I knew you when we were little and you bullied me.
So we can see like the independent women kind of through the time period of Robin Hood, kind of in the 1920s, and how she's just there. Like, she doesn't even have like an applicable role. She's just there. And then like the 1930s versions, she starts to get a little more involved and has more of a reason to be in the movie. And then once you get to the 1950s, we see her kind of taking on more of that collaboration role. And then by you get to 1990s, then so I think it's really cool that through these time periods, especially when they were made, they're telling the same story kind of in their own way and depictions of their own society.
It's very interesting how these movies decide to interpret her, because there is no like set version of Maid Marian and there's no set version of Robin Hood, so it's very interesting to see how these characters like react with the times. Ridley Scott's 2010 one with Russell Crowe is probably the most attempt to be like historically accurate. There is no like true historical accuracy. You can't reach historical accuracy, is my opinion, because like you're not living in 1191. So the 2018 one, it tries to be fantasy, and then like it's based in history, but also there's like men wearing like beanies. It looks very 2018. Maid Marian, she's a thief in that movie, I believe. So she's like her own sort of Robin Hood character. Her clothes, though, they are not any less objectifying than any other version. The 2018 one also plays a lot with like the religion aspect. I believe the antagonist is the church in that one, and it is like an essential part of the story of Robin Hood, because the Crusades are an essential part of the story of Robin Hood, and so how different stories like work that in is kind of interesting.
The next thing we're going to talk about is kind of like Jane Austen. So the first thing I want to mention is the Regency era. It went from 1795 to 1837, but from the time that it's really depicted as the Regency era is 1811 to 1820. It's actually named after George, Prince Regent. The Regency era was very classical, and it was a rise of authors and styles of art. So 1830s when Queen Victoria at the age of 18 succeeded the throne, and that's when it went into the more Victorian era, which was characterized by Queen Victoria. The empire waist was the silhouette that dominated in the Regency time. So the waistline was just below the bust. It accentuated the natural body shape, because before there was more exaggerated hips and
like the
bustles.
Marie Antoinette, like the Rococo earlier.
Rococo kind of style. This same empire waist style is kind of also seen in the 1920s flapper dress, how it's a very more boxy silhouette.
I always think about that, like the beginning of these centuries, like the early 1800s have this, I think that it's very inspired by like Greek and Roman sort of like this neoclassical look, like they literally look like columns, and it's like very like extreme waist. And in the 1920s, again, like very changing fashion ideals of the time, and they have these like lower waists, but they both have this very like straight silhouette to them.
With Regency dresses, the like risky thing about them is the necklines, and with 1920s dresses, the risky thing about them is the your legs are out.
They were very fond of the white style and pastel colors, as Aubrey said, and that was traditionally back to the Greek and Roman style. It's just like it was not only in color but also in form of the silhouette.
When we think of the Regency time period, it is like this Pride and Prejudice, like white dresses. I know that not all of the dresses were like that. I think that I don't love the costumes in Bridgerton, but I think it is interesting because it depicts the time period as very colorful, and we know for a fact that there were a lot of colorful dresses, but for sure like this simple like plain white like pale dress was sort of the ideal for the time period.
So Emma, there's a 2020 version that was directed by Autumn de Wilde, and it's actually really interesting that you say that, because color is something they used in the 2020 version especially in order to depict status. And Emma is seen because it wasn't just pastels and whites that kind of was part of the Regency era. Harriet also is going to be wearing a lot more of the neutral tones, while Emma's wearing bright yellow and all these extravagant colors. She said, "The clothes emerging from the fashion plates depended on interpretation ability and money and confidence."
Alexandra Byrne did a really good job like I said, I don't think historical accuracy, I don't think you can actually reach it.
No.
But if you do want historical accuracy in costumes, I think that she gets like pretty much as close as you possibly can. I almost wonder if one of the reasons why the 2020 Emma is able to lean so far into historical accuracy is because Jane Austen and like the Regency time period have been having a bit of a moment recently with the popularity of Pride and Prejudice and also Bridgerton for sure.
I think that comes with the fashion cycle because like Y2K clothes are really in right now.
Well, and that's actually what I was going to bring up too, is because Jane Austen, her stories really hit the world by storm in the 1990s, and it became so popular. And then even with the fashion trends too, like you do see how you were saying Y2K that's coming back. And so I think it's like that's why we're seeing these movies being recreated again. Jane Austen is one of the most influential authors that came out of that time, and also one of the authors that is, quite honestly, they call her Lady Shakespeare because she's probably one of the most notable authors in history in that sense.
Oh yeah.
Clueless, for example, that was 1990s. It's based off of Emma. It's very different from what, in terms of fashion, and what was happening in the 90s at the time, which I think is very important to mention. And so Cher, with the status and money she had, of course was going to be wearing all of these clothes. Classic yellow plaid outfit is very recognizable to this day, and people wear it for Halloween costumes all the time because it's so iconic.
Probably the most famous Jane Austen adaptations is Pride and Prejudice. And the most popular ones are the 1995 ones, which was BBC made for TV. It's very long. And it is very, I think it's trying to rely on more like historical depictions. And then there's the 2005 one, which is directed by Joe Wright, stars Keira Knightley. It is not relying as much on historical accuracy. Not only that, but it's also not set in the Regency time period. The director of Pride and Prejudice thought that in 2005 he looked at Regency dresses and he said, those are ugly. I don't want that. His movie is supposed to be set slightly earlier in
the late 1700s.
In like 1790s.
Yeah, because that's when Jane Austen released the first draft, or like wrote the first draft of Pride. Because Keira Knightley is like such a petite lady, he didn't want to put her in Regency dresses.
They dropped the waistline on purpose when they were talking with the costume designers, because that's like the huge thing, that the costumes in it are not accurate with the Regency time period because the waistline is dropped, because they were like, her form is not going to fit this.
Yeah, so these costumes are Jacqueline Duran.
Changing some aspects of the story, even like the Bennets in the 2005 one, they're not like an affluent family, they're almost like a farmer family. Like they have like pigs.
Yeah. It was funny because there was a quote from Joe Wright that he was talking about how I feel like the characters look a lot more disheveled than they do in the 1995 version. And he actually said, he's like, messy is beautiful. I think tidiness is ugly, and that's just my aesthetic. One thing you know is that we are comparing like a TV series almost to a cinematic movie. And so there are going to be those differences in that sense.
The 1995 one was just aiming to retell, which is fine, obviously. There's nothing wrong with that. And it is. I think it's good. I think it's good.
But I agree with Quincy.
With the film, there is an intention to like interpret the story for a modern audience in a very artistic way.
I think it goes back to the nostalgia thing. Like, if you would have grown up with the 1995 version, like, you were like, Colin Firth is my Mr. Darcy. Dina Collin is the one that actually designed those costumes, and she did do a really great job in trying to get, like, I agree with Alyssa in the sense that clothing will never be 100% accurate in historical films. Like, no matter how hard you try, it's never going to be historically accurate to the T, because they are not clothes that come from that time. They're being made in a modern time.
Yeah.
And so, but Dina Collin, she did do a really good job, and she actually received a lot of backlash for how a lot of her costumes were more on the historical accuracy side, because it wasn't appealing as much to an audience.
The 2005 one, I really like how they went like, it's not like super elegant all of the time. Like, she wears like this brown
the pinafore,
which I like, because Elizabeth Bennet is like kind of like a bookish like like she's like a weird girl where like they're getting ready together, Elizabeth and Jane, and I feel like the undergarments are pretty well done.
They are very well done.
They are wearing like short stays, which would be what was worn.
I've heard multiple actresses all say that they really enjoyed the experience on set, and like all of the clothes that they wore were really comfortable for them to be. Another character whose costumes are interesting are Caroline's. Hers are definitely more fashion forward. She has the higher waistline in all of her costumes, and she also has like really short sleeves in a couple of them.
Yeah.
Especially the ballroom.
She's
one
sleeveless.
She is sleeveless.
They said it's like a touch of sensuality.
She looks like an early 2000s mean girl, and they have to communicate that visually. And I think the thin sleeves are meant to communicate visually that she's a mean girl.
I feel like with the Bennett sisters, you have more of the flowy, whimsical chiffons and organzas more than you have with Caroline's more satins and more of the silks the fiber, but satin fabrics that are going to stand out in more bold colors because, again, higher status.
Another thing I think is interesting about the 2005 version is that there's been a rumor, I guess, that they didn't wear makeup. One of the actresses just recently for one of the sisters on like TikTok was like, yeah, we really didn't wear like hardly any makeup. Like I think they did their eyebrows and maybe a little bit of mascara and like skin correcting, but for like lipstick and blush they would use like beads.
That's so awesome.
I think
this is so
Jenna Malone. I do believe that probably was mostly what was going on for the Bennett sisters. I suspect that for Caroline and some of the other characters, they were wearing more makeup. Because makeup isn't just like everyday makeup that like I would wear. It's like film makeup, so it's a little bit different. So
for the vibes of the Bennett family, like their hair is not terrible. And also I like how they style their hair. At the ball especially, they wear like flowers in their hair, and Elizabeth has these like pearls in her hair, which I think is such an iconic look.
There's like a different type of realism to it, like rather than being like historically accurate, it brings in like a different type of realism.
Yeah, they're like human.
That one's interesting too because that has a wraparound bodice where the fabric is it's wrapped around. That was invented in the 1790s. Like that came to be, which would make sense because when you were saying that they based it off Jane Austen's first kind of thing, it would make sense that that style is in that movie because it's the 1790s style.
Their mom, though, throughout the movie, she wears way older clothes, which is what they usually do with like older ladies.
It's meant to convey something to the audience, like this person is older. That it's not historically accurate.
Pride and Prejudice in 1940. It was directed by Robert Z. Leonard, starring Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier. And then costume designer Adrian Aldoff, Greenberg, and Giles Steele. And it was important for me to mention that the Victorian era happened as soon as King George IV died. In 1830, Queen Victoria succeeded the throne. A lot of the style in this movie is not Regency. It is clearly Victorian era.
Yeah.
And it's not even in the Regency era. And it was really interesting because I kind of was doing research because I was like, okay, well, this movie is primarily, like, they don't really even have the accents of the English, and so they're very much, it's an American film, and so it was really interesting to see how that played into it, and that kind of like threw me for a loop being so familiar with the Pride and Prejudice as we know. This was a time of wartime, and it was a form of escapism is what the costume designers and the director kind of took into play. And so they wanted to do extravagant clothing, and it was a romantic because the Victorian era was more reverted back to the romanticism styles. And so it was interesting to see how these costumes kind of resembled luxury, as even with their hair as well. Like it was more supposed to take up space and give presents. And Adrian himself was a very theatrical, like we were talking about with Robin Hood in those movies. These costumes were a lot more theatrical and over the top. And so they didn't want to go into, they were saying that they didn't want to go into more of the Regency style due to the wartime because of the idea of rationing clothing. And it was more going to be because clearly an Empire style dress uses less fabric than a Victorian era Romanticism dress.
This version of Pride and Prejudice from 1940 was set in the 1830s, which has a very, very distinct look to it. Obviously, the Regency time period is distinct, but the 1830s, it's like a shorter like fashion trend, but it almost is more extreme than the Regency time period because it had these giant sleeves, and that's what's the most recognizable aspect of the 1830s, the like earliest Victorian fashion trend. It visually uses more fabric, like it's so much more extravagant, and so people who would in 1940 be going to the movies to escape this the wartime would see this like very extravagant depiction of the 1830s, and it would allow them to just like escape for a little bit. It's not the 50s yet, so it doesn't have the the complete hourglass, but by the 40s people definitely the ideal was like a tight waist.
I think this dress is really interesting because it's very 40s.
Yeah.
It's like very almost power suits.
Yeah.
Like, it looks like a sturdy fabric.
Yeah.
It has the collar and the buttons. Like
The
that's
collar-
like a wartime dress.
The collars specifically, like the almost Peter Pan collars. Like they could have just made something completely like fictional, but it's very interesting that they chose the 1830s specifically and then did a pretty good job at like replicating those fashions. They're not like 100% historically accurate, obviously. They're still very 40s, but it is very interesting that they do a very good job at imitating those in a 40s style.
To be or not to be.
Obviously, Hamlet is written by Shakespeare. We know him, we love him. May he rest in peace. Hamlet is generally thought to be set sometime in the 13 or 1400s in Denmark. So in the Elizabethan era, female actors weren't allowed on stage, which meant that female characters in Shakespeare's play were played by men, or usually like young boys. There was cross-dressing in a lot of his stories, and he used that as like a convention so the female characters would be allowed to like be a part of the story. In more modern plays, usually women will play male characters, like just as like casting that is completely blind to gender. Usually it's on the stage. I think almost exclusively like a lot of like modern Shakespearean casting is kind of blind to gender. She's the Man is a retelling of Twelfth Night, but it's like a comedic cross-dressing.
Yeah.
In 1881, his name was Edward P. Vining, and he wrote a book called The Mystery of Hamlet, in which he argued that Hamlet has feminine qualities, and he says that can be explained by his solution that Hamlet is a woman. So that is the main premise of the 1921 film. If we imagine that the poet here portrayed a woman incapable of accomplishing the revenge which the perturbed spirit of her father had imposed upon her, driven to the borders of distraction by unbearable burdens, suffering from a hopeless love that she might never reveal, tortured by jealousy, sorely sensitive to all the woman's natural faults, and incensed far more at the sacrifice of personal purity made by her mother in marrying again so speedily, than even by the murder of her father, shrinking from the mortal struggle with the king, fearing bloodshed and viewing the possibility of her own death with a shuddering horror, and hence anxious to find some escape, some easier method of fulfilling her duty, that which before seemed at variance with all ordinary modes of thinking now becomes an exhibition of the deepest human feeling. What a run-on sentence, first of all. He's not a professional writer, and it's a little misogynistic, but it is a really interesting premise, because in, especially like old stories, like insanity is like a very feminine thing, and so for like Hamlet, like the Shakespeare character, to like experience that, it's kind of an interesting thing, especially when it's pitted against Ophelia. Hamlet is played by Asta Nielsen, and she actually opened her own production company to make this film. And Asta Nielsen, she had starred in movies before, and she had cross-dressed in movies before, but they were almost always comedies. So she was like a very significant figure for that androgynous but still feminine look. She had the blunt dark bob, and she's always wearing like the dark screen makeup, and she's like a very like slender womanly but also like androgynous.
Yeah, which is that is the 1920s
Yeah,
ideal.
In this movie, she starts off, she's very dramatic. It's very like German expressionist. She has like a long cape and a high collar. And throughout the movie, she kind of loses that. She loses her cape, and then she has scenes with Ophelia where she's like, looks more comfortable in clothes. And in the final scene, where Hamlet dies, Astrid Nielsen is wearing like more disheveled clothes. The other female characters in Hamlet are like kind of the 1920s version of what you would imagine they would think of medieval.
Yeah, like the 1922 Robin Hood.
Hair and like long robes. So the basic premise of this movie is that the queen is giving birth to Hamlet while the king is at war, and she gets news that the king dies, and Hamlet is born a girl that she says, hey everyone, the prince is born, so she can pass down power to her son. Astrid Nielsen's other cross-dressing movies are comedies. This one is not a comedy. Throughout the movie, he had a crush on Horatio, and Horatio's in love with Ophelia, so it's like... In the 1920s, cross-dressing was not out there. It wasn't like the craziest thing. It was like, hey family, we're gonna go see some cross-dressing on the movie screen. We're gonna love it. The heterosexual couples are united and social orders are restored. In the same way as Shakespeare used cross-dressing, the female characters were able to have more like privilege and access than they would as a female character, but it's only temporary. In Hamlet, there's the pairing between Ophelia and Hamlet, which is not heterosexual because Hamlet is technically not actually a man. Ophelia doesn't know that. And then there's the pairing between Horatio and Hamlet, which is also not really a heterosexual pairing because
they're both presenting as men.
At the end of the movie, both couples can be understood as heterosexual couples, but it's not really like restoring the order. So in the final scene when Hamlet is killed by Laertes, Horatio discovers that Hamlet is a woman. In this movie, it's not surprise, it's like sadness. The English translation of it says, only death betrays your secret that you have the golden heart of a woman. And then he kisses Hamlet. It's like accepted. The court isn't like, Horatio's kissing Hamlet. They're just like, poor Hamlet. And then they carry Hamlet out like in a procession as they would. This says just like a knight. The ending allows for different readings. In the temporary transvestite genre, it is an example of the paradoxical kiss. Horatio kisses Hamlet, and while Hamlet's male attire, her disguise, implies homosexuality, knowledge of the character's true identity offers a heterosexual reading. So the character of Ophelia is definitely like an archetype of a fair young maiden, like an innocent, feminine girl. She doesn't really have her own thing going on. It's always like she's complimenting Hamlet's story. Even though her ending is like just as tragic, it like just serves to complement Hamlet's tragic story. Feminist readings of Hamlet have drawn criticism of Shakespeare, of the way that he portrays like the submissiveness of his female characters and like the madness of Ophelia. In more recent interpretations of Hamlet, there has been an attempt to kind of grow Ophelia as her own character. The first movie I'm going to talk about is the 1948 one, which stars Laurence Olivier as Hamlet. 1948 was the first year that costume design was a category at the Academy Awards. And the costume designer for this, Roger First, he was the first ever recipient of this award. There are also kind of just like general interpretations of like medieval clothing. The costumes are very like jewelry heavy. They have like a lot of embroidery, similar to the hairstyles of the other things we've talked about. Gertrude has victory rolls. The camera movement is heavily inspired by like Orson Welles. The camera is kind of an active participant in the story and like portrays what Hamlet's thinking, and like moves around. The actress that plays Gertrude, who's Hamlet's mother, was 30 in this movie. Mm-hmm. Her actress was 30. Laurence Olivier, guess how old he was?
30.
41.
I was close.
He's more than 10 years older than the lady who was playing his mother. The Ophelia in this This says she's denied personhood. Her character, madness, and death are exploited with the intention of creating a lyrical effect. Ophelia is played by 18-year-old Jean Simmons. The portrayal of Ophelia in this movie was inspired by Pre-Raphaelite paintings, like a very like fragile, and she's like always wearing white. The 1991 is made by Franco Zeffirelli, who made the 1968 Romeo and Juliet. It stars Mel Gibson as Hamlet and Helena Bonham Carter as Ophelia, and it's set in medieval Denmark, and the costume designer's name is Mauricio Milanati, and he had inspirations from the Byzantine era. I think they really like stuck to like historical accuracy, which is interesting. And then some of the outfits are a little bit more like fantastical rather than historical.
The headpieces are always interesting for me because I don't think anyone gets them right. I think even in like Robin Hood and also like bonnets in Pride and Prejudice, no one gets them right. They always do like something, but it's never that. Maybe is sort of has to do with like the hair never really quite being. It's always the least historically inspired and the most modernized. I feel like hair accessories, they're always just sort of like we'll put something there, and if it looks close, then that's good enough.
So
Same with
Ophelia
Maid Marian.
is played by Helena Bonham Carter. She was like so sad and pathetic in this movie. It's like a lot of like white and blue and pink. Like contrasting with Gertrude, she's like very simple. Her hair's always down. It's never like really fancy. Comparable to the 1948 Ophelia in the way that she is kind of just complimenting Hamlet's story.
Yeah, she's there to be a pretty sad woman.
Yeah. In this 1991, her body gets stuck in the like a lagoon. In other words, Zeffirelli seems to be saying that her confinement, her banishment from this male-centered world continues even after death.
Even just like today, like I feel like Ophelia is such an idea too of like the sadness but essence of being beautiful still.
Yeah.
And like she just has a grasp, like the essence of her character just has a grasp on so many artists and like in music and literature.
She's a muse.
Yeah,
She's
she
like
is a
the
muse.
tragic woman.
She
is.
In my opinion. So the 1996 one is directed by Kenneth Branagh, and he also plays Hamlet, and Ophelia is played by Kate Winslet. The costume designer for this was Alexandra Byrne, and it's her first movie project that she did, and this Shakespeare is over 4 hours long because they put in every word of the original play. Like, with I think a few details changed. Like, it is the full play. Ophelia and Hamlet, like, have a sexual relationship, which is shown on screen, which is almost never shown. The love story between Ophelia and Hamlet is, like, really pronounced in this movie. This Hamlet is set in the late Victorian era, and I think it also has a heavy Russian influence. It reminds me a little bit of
Like the
Romanovs. I think this movie is different from the other ones in the way that it's been compared to like an epic. It's very stylized and like grand, and it's set in this big Victorian castle. As for the costumes, there's like a heavy military influence on them. It's not medieval at all. The film begins with the wedding between Claudius and Gertrude. Ophelia at the beginning of the movie. She's in like this bright red, like it's like that's like a military outfit. Throughout the movie, like she gradually loses her mind, and then her hair's up, and by the end of the movie it's down, and her clothes are unbuttoned, and she's not wearing anything, and it's kind of like maidenly, but it's also kind of like, I don't know, like practical. Her descent into madness is like a result of the men in her life like treating her poorly, and that's like shown as opposed to the other ones where it's like she went crazy because her dad is dead. The movie's not making her like the type of victim that previous Ophelias have. Like, it's like she is, I don't know, it's like almost like a more feminist interpretation.
Like she's more strong-willed, or
like, I don't know, because she still dies. She still is like tragic.
Yeah, but she has more of her own character.
Kind of a standing in the film and role.
There's a scene in this movie where she is in a straitjacket, and the treatment of her madness in this movie is comparable to 19th century treatment of women's madness. So it's like a more like modern interpretation of that, and almost feminist in a way, because she like isn't this like soft, frail flower that other Ophelias might be. Yeah, this says, by refusing to show her dead body on the screen, Byrne seems to be undermining those interpretations that read her suicide and death as signs of her defeat, her giving into the overpowering patriarchal order, or her acceptance of ultimate passivity and silence. Byrne's Ophelia is only reportedly dead. Which is interesting, because that leads us into the next Hamlet, or the next Ophelia, which is the 2018 movie
Ophelia.
which is about Ophelia.
Oh.
So Ophelia is played by Daisy Ridley, and Hamlet's played by George McKay. Costume designer for this is Massimo Cantini Parini. Before, Ophelia is only like a supporting character, and her insanity is paralleling Hamlet's insanity. But this movie is about Ophelia and how she like defies that. It's definitely a feminist retelling. It's also focuses on Gertrude. Like Ophelia and Gertrude's relationship. Her character is almost tomboyish. She's like running through the woods and is one with nature. She's like not traditionally the feminine Ophelia. The costume designer said that he wanted the clothes to express femininity as very fluid, exalting the women at the center of the film as strong characters. With the story's historical period, it was important that the audience could get enchanted by the clothes enough to imagine the sensuality breathing below the surface. So this also is not historical, it's more like fantasy.
Yeah.
There's witches in this movie. So they're very like whimsical. The designer said that Ophelia's character and clothing was a reference to like ancient Greece and like romantic medieval ages.
They're like believably worn almost, less like the 40s style of like theatrical.
They're also free-flowing clothes as opposed to like maybe like Victorian clothes. They're still romantic. Fortuny designed this dress inspired by ancient Greek art. It's called the Delphos dress.
It has these like little like pleats, like it folds and it flows very nicely.
Like, I feel like in all the fashion we've seen too, like the pleats are what are very defining of like a femininity kind of dress.
Yeah.
But especially when you were saying that it wasn't as more feminine, it still has
Still
that
like romantic.
Yeah.
Here are the Ophelia paintings that are the main inspiration for this one and also the 1948 one, which is interesting because
They interpret them differently
They
based on the
interpret
time
them-
periods that they were
yeah.
created in.
I think that the clothes in this 2018 Ophelia are definitely more similar than
Yeah.
the 1940s one. One of the coolest scenes which demonstrates the stylistic choices is there's a masquerade scene. The women aren't wearing masks, like physical masks. Instead, they're wearing like makeup. It also reminds me a little bit of like Romeo and Juliet. This says the 1968 one, but also Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. The wedding between Gertrude and Claudius, the women are wearing historically accurate veils, but that's the only time that they're wearing them. And then in her scene where she's going mad, which she actually is pretending, she's wearing this very pale dress, which is different from her other ones that are mostly blue.
Well,
Looks
water.
looks great with her hair. Water. She fakes her death, but Hamlet finds out she fakes her death, but Hamlet still dies. But she escapes the narrative and apparently has a kid.
A daughter.
A daughter. The movie definitely had a lot of criticism. I think that happens whenever you mess with beloved stories.
Yeah.
And it's not a perfect movie, but I do think it's a really interesting change of pace. Just a quick mention. It's not set in a different time period, but there is a 2009 Hamlet that stars Ethan Hawke and Julia Stiles, and apparently Hamlet is a film student.
Who is this Gatsby?
Do you know him?
War hero.
Mr. Gatsby doesn't exist.
Gatsby? What Gatsby?
So our last story collection of films is The Great Gatsby, specifically the ones from 1949, 1974, and 2013. The 1920s are very, they have a very specific look to them, like we mentioned before. So whenever you recreate that look or imitate it, depending on what time period it is, what decade it is, it turns out very differently. So in the 1949 one, it looks very 1949. They have this new look silhouette to them already, and some of the dresses look just like 1950s dresses. Like she has like this she has like the fluffy 50s hair and like the collar and the pearls and even the makeup. It's incredibly 1949. And even like Daisy wears a little party dress, and even the silhouette of that, it's very 1940s. Like you can see they tried to have this lower waist to it to imitate the 20s, but it doesn't really work because it's still very 1949. It looks like a 1949 prom dress almost. Like it's a 1949 evening gown. There are a couple of dresses throughout the film that have a more straight silhouette, but not really. Mostly they have like the hourglass figure. The other interesting thing about this movie is that it's not very Great Gatsby. They seemed to have a problem, I guess, with the original story, and so it's not changed, but it's shown in such a different way. So Jordan, who is a golfer, but in this movie, at the end, she like sides with Nick. It's 1949, but it's just full of these like 1950s ideals. Like they can't show Gatsby in like any other light. At the end, he's like, I'll be better, I'll become a better man, and then he dies, and that's all he has to him. And the 1970s one was designed by Fiona Aldridge, the 2013 one Catherine Martin, and like all the rest of these movies, they reflect the time period that they're in. But because the 20s is such a distinct time period, it kind of clashes with the 2013 style a little bit. I think it works better with the 70s fashion, with the sort of like long, like boyish kind of androgynous silhouette that the ideal of women had in the 70s. And also disco, very shiny. Got the shiny fringe. In the makeup, we can see, like we've mentioned before, that's where it sort of goes astray, is very much so in the 2013. It's the 2013 one. Like Daisy.
I think the hair is good though.
The hair is pretty good.
Actually does pretty good.
None of them. The 2013 one doesn't commit to like the like Clara Bow like big curly sort of bob, but they all have like Louise Brooks sort of bobs to them, which is 20s. It's just sort of the only one they have in there. The 70s one, I don't know, it seems to work the best. It has Mia Farrow as Daisy and Robert Redford as Jay Gatsby. Yeah, like they have these pale like summery outfits because it's hot, and so it just sort of like works. Daisy has a short haircut in all of the versions, but in the 74 one, it's not super 20s, but they sort of attempt to give it a 20s curl to it. She wears like fringed headdresses and stuff, which are
I like that.
Which are like gorgeous, and I think a very fun nod to the 20s. Yeah, and she wears like a lot of sheer like flowy fabrics in the 70s one. It just looks it's not that it's more historically accurate than even the 49 one or the 2013 one. It's just that it fits better with the narrative and like
the aesthetic
on the other hand, the 2013 one is very like it's like a big party. It's so loud and in your face, and so a lot of the costumes are sort of like that. They do have drop waists in the 2013 one. It's just like less so. But the designers of like the 1970s actually did take a lot of inspiration from the 20s and 30s in sort of the more boyish looks and like the like sleek sort of androgynous like dark makeup. Like we see a lot of high fashion looks that are sort of reminiscent of the 20s and 30s. I mean, you can even point to like the 60s. Twiggy has a kind of 20s look to her. Apparently, Robert Redford's costumes were designed by Ralph Lauren, which is I think it works very well because I think that Gatsby needs to be just as fashionable as Daisy, if not more so. So it's very cool that they decided to work very hard on the men's costuming in this movie. Well, the 1949 one, it does lean into like the noir, which makes sense, like a film noir, like crime almost. It doesn't work for the story of Gatsby because Gatsby's not supposed to be like this black and white, like gangsters.
It's greed, love, violence. Like it's just like Gatsby's very much, it's an extravagant, idealistic life that is actually terrible.
Yeah, like this romanticization of the past is like actively harmful, you know? I do think it is interesting in the 1949 one. Some of the only costumes that I noticed, and I was like, this is very interesting, are the ones from the past, are the ones from like the 1910s. They do look like they're from the 1910s. They look like they've been inspired by like Paul Poiret, and they have the 1910s silhouette. There's still a 1940s version of that, but they're a very good 1940s version of that. It's just a very interesting contrast to the rest of the costumes in the film, where the rest of the costumes, they're like, oh, but we need to appeal to a woman in 1949 who might want to wear this. In the book, he has a pink suit. He wears a pink suit, right? Which makes Tom look at him and be like, ugh, which makes sense because Jay is like kind of, he's very rich, he's sort of flamboyant, and so, you know, this pink suit's not something super crazy, but for Tom, who's like the epitome of toxic masculinity, it's something too outrageous. But in the 40s version, he doesn't wear a pink suit. I mean, it's black and white, so we can't visually see it, but there's no mention of like this pink suit. It's not there, unfortunately. However, in the 1970s and the 2013 version, he wears a pink suit in both of those, and so in both of those they have this sort of argument.
Well, yes, I went there.
Sure. The man in the pink suit went to Oxford.
Tom!
Honestly, that's one of the most interesting costumes. So it's such a shame that the 49 one doesn't have it, because it shows his character a lot. Yeah. And it also shows like the character of Tom.
The pink suit, it was interesting that you mentioned though earlier that with the 1970s it just works more. It like works better. I honestly agree with that, because like the 1970s, especially with men's suits, they did have more pastels in their wardrobes. And so when you see it on Leonardo DiCaprio, you're like, cool, Leo. And then it's like you see it on Robert Redford,
you're like, oh, it works. Wow. Yeah.
And I also feel like it was the way it was styled, like how you said with the 1974 too.
The way that these movies play with like gender and sexuality is very interesting, because it's pretty heavily implied, I think, in the book that Nick is gay. The films don't really showcase that. In the that's why I think the 1949 one is so interesting, because he has this infatuation with Gatsby, and to Nick, he's like, yes, it's because he's a good man, unlike the rest of us. But that's not true, and so you have to look at it closer and be like, why is he so infatuated with Gatsby?
Yeah. There's that scene in the 2013 one where they're driving their cars to the city, and there's a car of like a bunch of like black characters who are like obviously also like rich, affluent people. Have like Josephine Baker like type dancers.
They reference like a lot of the black culture of the 20s. They have something pretty similar to that in the 1949 one. But there's also obviously the 1920s are an interesting time for women's fashion, because like Jordan is kind of masculine in some of the versions, not at all in the 40s one. Like I was saying, Nick is not interested at all in Gatsby in the 40s one. He has a romantic relationship with Jordan. And so she's not, like, she's very, like, girlish. She's not tomboy at all. In the 1974 one, she's a little bit more tomboyish. She wears clothes that kind of remind me of, like, mod fashion, which would be a pretty good comparison to like 20s flapper girls. In the 2013 one, she actually wears pants. We see her wearing pants a couple of times. It's very interesting how these costumes are able to play around with the gender of these characters a little bit, and how willing people were to do so.
It was really cool to study and like be able to watch multiple films, especially films that talked about and covered the same story about how genders were actually portrayed in different time periods, but with the same storyline. It's kind of like, it's like same story, different font, but like also portrayed and like talked about different things, especially when it came to cross cultures, different regions, different idealistic ways. Feminism like also pops up a couple times, and then also referencing it's like a span of centuries that is seen. And so I just think it's really interesting to see how film not only has evolved, and also the incorporation of literature and music, and how that also, it all combines into one thing. It's really interesting to see how, as a humanity, the stories like go along and are very influential in today's world.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting how much creative liberty people are willing to take with something, how like the compromise that they make between drawing from a specific time period or a variety of specific time periods and then their own time period, like how much they really want to appease their modern audience and how, you know, how the stories change over time. Like the stories themselves, the plot is altered by the clothes that the people wear, the set production. Like the 1938 Robin Hood has just a more upbeat tone just because it's visually more colorful compared to the 1990s versions, which are visually darker and they just convey a different thing. So it's just interesting how outside things influence costumes and stories.
Yeah, I just love Hamlet so much. Someone needs to make a modern Hamlet movie. Not like a modern one, but like someone needs to reinterpret Aston Nelson's Hamlet. I'll fund it. My life savings, I'll put it on that movie. That's it, guys.
That's all you have to say. That's your finishing thoughts.
Yeah, in the coffin.
Okay. That's all. That's all.
Bye.